climate change. So I highly recommend those. I recommend Skeptical Science itself for just factual information on climate change. And I also recommend the Six Americas work by the Yale Climate Program, because Six Americas really helps us understand different people's attitudes on climate change and why they feel that way. Again, people are not stupid. People have reasons for feeling the way they do, and they're good reasons. And the first step, I think, towards moving forward with any talks or conversations we have is understanding and respecting people's reasons.
Great. All right, well, that's going to wrap up our time today. Once again, if you'd like to purchase Dr. Hayhoe's book, it's titled A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. You can obviously find that on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, all those good sites. Dr. Hayhoe, thanks again for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Before we get started, please allow me to introduce her. For those of you who don't know, Catherine has a Bachelor's of Science in Physics and Astronomy from the University of Toronto and a Master's and PhD in Atmospheric Science from the University of Illinois. Dr. Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change, while also being an expert reviewer for the Nobel Peace Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And right now, she currently serves as an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, which is part of the Department of Interior's South Central Climate Science Center. Catherine develops new ways to quantify the potential impacts of human activities at the regional scale. Her life's work has been dedicated to not only discovering, but also communicating the realities of climate change to those who will be affected most by it. She teamed up with her husband, Andrew Farley, who's author, professor, and lead teaching pastor of Ecclesia, to write A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. It's a book that untangles the complex science and tackles many long-held misconceptions about global warming. And of course, most importantly to us, Dr. Hayhoe is a member of Citizen Climate Lobby's Advisory Board, and in that capacity, she joins us today to speak about communicating climate change within our families and with our close friends. Dr. Hayhoe, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so if you would, start us off by walking us through your story, not only about discovering that your husband didn't believe in climate change way back in the day, but also what it was like to realize that you and your husband really weren't on the same page.
Yes, well, I grew up in Canada and in South America, and for me, climate change was something I learned about in school. I learned about deforestation, I learned about pollution, and I learned about climate change. It wasn't until I moved to the States for grad school in atmospheric science to study climate policy that I realized that there was a lot of people who didn't think that climate change was real. And that was a huge shock for me. I mean, up to that point, it kind of been, the sky is blue, the grass is green, climate change is real. I also didn't really realize the severity of the issue until I started to study it myself. Again, it was kind of on par with a lot of other things that we're worried about in the background of our lives as we go about our day-to-day business. So moving to the States, I found out that a lot of people didn't think climate change was real. And it wasn't just kind of people over there, out there. It turned out to be a lot of my friends, a lot of the people that I know. And it even turned out to be my husband. It took about 6 months after we were married until we actually realized that he didn't think climate change was real, and I was. Now, you might say, well, what did you talk about? Well, we had a lot to talk about. And, when you're in grad school, you're kind of down in the weeds. Thinking about I was doing my study on the chemistry of methane, so I would talk a lot about that, not so much about climate change. But I think it's a very valuable experience to realize that that people we know and people we respect can think that climate change isn't real. It isn't a matter of being stupid. It isn't a matter of being ignorant. In fact, people who don't think climate change is real often have better reasons to support their opinion than some people who do.
Wow.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So what we have to realize is that if there's people who we respect, people who we know are smart, and people who we have relationships with and we care about, we can talk about climate change, and that's what we're going to talk about today, in a way that can actually, hopefully, make our relationship stronger instead of getting to the point where we don't want to ever see each other again.
All right. So I'm glad to know that during your honeymoon you weren't discussing climate change with your husband.
No.
That's probably the key to a successful marriage. So.
Probably.
So as you talk about this in this evolution, so to speak, of how you guys started to get on the same page, what was most effective or most helpful when talking to your husband about climate change? Something that we could relate to use with our families as well.
Mm-hmm. I think there's two key components to being able to have a good, open discussion on the issue of climate change. One is connecting on a level of our shared values. If we have a relationship with somebody, we have to share some values with them. Otherwise, we wouldn't be family or we wouldn't be friends. So what are the values that we both agree on and we both share? Let's figure out what those are and then talk about climate change from the perspective of those values. The other important thing, for us at least, was to get to the answer on key questions that were kind of holding us back. So for example, is climate really changing? It's invaluable to be able to go to the NASA website, download the temperature data into your own computer, plug it into Excel, and actually plot the line and see that it's going up. And so you might hear on the news, oh, global warming has stopped, but it's not that hard to go get the data yourself and look at it. And so, for example, in my resources and in the Skeptical Science resources, that's exactly what they try to do. They try to give people the information we need to get the correct answers because there's so much misinformation out there. You could go back and forth forever saying, yes, it's warming, no, it isn't. It's bad, no, it isn't. I mean, unless you get some facts, we're never going to be able to answer these questions and move forward.
Okay, so approaching people, like you said, based on shared values and then really speaking from a fact-based perspective was really helpful for you.
Yes.
All right. So let's go a little deeper into that. And what kind of conversations did you guys have,
Many conversations over probably about 2 years. A lot of the conversations related to what about this and what about that. And so that's why, again, resources like Skeptical Science are so helpful because they've already asked what about this and what about that, and they've already assembled all the information that we need to figure out the right answers to those questions. I think that in retrospect, we didn't focus as much on the values as I wish we had now. And so, for example, heading into the holiday season when we tend to have a lot of time spent with our family and our friends, that's an important time to really get into those values, and it disarms a lot of the hostility. If we say, we're both moms, we both really love our kids. Hey, did you know climate change is going to affect our kids? And this is why I'm worried about climate change. How can anybody argue with you if you say you're worried about your kids?
Right.
And these are core values that many of us have.
I like that, and I think it's beneficial for us to know as well as that it was like a 2-year process, you said. So if a world famous climate scientist has that much problems, we should not put too much pressure on ourselves to change everybody, over one Christmas season.
Exactly.
All right. So what did you find? I guess some of the things that didn't help when you guys have these conversations, or some things that we should avoid saying or getting into.
Oh, that's a great question. What didn't help is basically bad-mouthing or saying bad things about other people. So, for example, if someone says, "Well, I heard on a certain news network that global warming has stopped," if you respond with, "Well, that news network is full of crap," then that's the end of your discussion.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And also if you let it get personal in a way that is divisive rather than unifying. So rather than talking about shared values, like we both want a healthy economy, we're both worried about our jobs, or we all want energy security so that we're not depending on other countries. Those are all things that we agree on. But if we start from saying, okay, well, I'm from this party and you're from that political party, now let's talk about climate change. Well, you've just divided yourself right there. It's just not going to work.
Awesome. Okay. So, and I think you've spoken a little bit about this, but if you have anything else to add on this question, I guess ways that we can engage family members who just don't get it. I think you spoke a little bit about it, obviously looking at shared values and trying to approach them from that perspective. Is there anything else you would say as far as how we can sort of lower that barrier that some people may have, the people who just don't get it? Or we think don't get it?
Yeah. Right. Yes, there's one more important thing, and this relates directly to the research that I do, and that is that I think it's really important to educate ourselves on what the impacts of climate change will be on things that we care about and things that our friends and our family would also care about. So we have this perception often that climate change is about the polar bears up in the Arctic. But if climate change is actually about that terrible bug infestation that we had in our backyard, imagine what a great topic of conversation that is at Christmas. Wow, did you get those terrible beetles? Yeah, I got those beetles too. Can you believe how bad they are? Yeah, they're actually getting worse because of climate change. That's an example literally right in our backyards. There are all kinds of resources online tracking the impacts of climate change on our food, on our water, on drought, on heat waves, on human health, and that is a lot of the work I do, and that's a lot of what the U.S. National Climate Assessment tries to do too. It tries to bring the impacts of climate change down to the local level where we live, so we can actually pick up these little vignettes of information and say, hey, you live in Texas, did you know that droughts are getting worse in Texas because it's hotter and rainfall patterns are changing? Wasn't that a bad drought that you've had the last couple of years? Imagine if that was the average conditions in 20 or 30 years. What would you do? I mean, these are the types of conversation starters that that you can engage people with, rather than saying, you know, what do you think about climate change? Oh, you're wrong.
Right. That's usually a good non-starter for everybody. I agree. So we talked about the holidays are approaching, the Christmas season, and so from a faith-based perspective, it's been very important in your life, in your work, in your book. What are some, things that we should focus on or try to stay away from, just strictly from a faith-based perspective?
Well, one of the things that most faiths are really good at is guilt. Catholics may say they have the corner on guilt, but I think Baptists could give them a good run for their money too. So I think that it's very tempting to try to use guilt, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you just bought that big car, or that GMC Yukon, or oh my goodness, I can't believe you're doing X or doing Y. That's terrible. Guilt doesn't work. It makes people angry. It makes people resistant. I mean, I had somebody tell me once that every time I turned on my car, it was a sin. So, I mean, it made me feel like going out, turning on my car, and driving in circles around this man.
Right.
So we have to avoid trying to use guilt as a motivator. God created this world, and look what a terrible job we're doing taking care of it. I mean, that is not going to make anybody feel like really changing long term. Instead, I think that a faith-based perspective offers wonderful opportunities to relate our faith-based values that we already have and that many of us share to the issue of climate change. So, for example, if we believe that the earth was created and given to people to take care of, to steward, to care for, then, if you believe that the God of the universe gave us this incredible gift of this planet that sustains our physical life, doesn't it make all the sense in the world to take care of it?
Right.
If we believe that we're told to love our neighbor as ourselves, and that's the number one commandment is love, if we believe that, well, climate change is impacting people all around the world, people who don't have the resources to adapt to climate change. They already don't have enough food or water, they don't have job security, they don't have good homes. As sea level rises, many of those homes will be lost. As rainfall patterns shift, many of their food sources will be lost. So we're not loving people by doing this. And so, you could say, well, I gave to World Vision or Compassion International this Christmas to help poor children. Well, World Vision is so concerned about climate change, they have a climate change director to try to figure out how climate change is making all the problems World Vision is already addressing worse. So there's a lot of faith-based organizations that are concerned about climate change. There's statements from the National Association of Evangelicals on how climate change affects the poor. There's really good pieces of information that we could get and educate ourselves on, so we could say, hey, you know what? Here's what these guys say about climate change, and you think these guys are pretty good. Maybe we should look at what they say together instead of going to, the IPCC or something like that. Let's go to organizations and people that we trust.
Okay. And so, you talked about, I guess it's some of us have a problems trying to square that circle, so to speak, sometimes, because we want to approach it from a like you said, shared values of faith and being good stewards of the earth, but there's also the values that some people hold that say, it's a big government solution, therefore it's against those values that I believe in. So any tips or thoughts on how we sort of square that or align that a little more?
Man, that's the toughest one, because I actually really believe that in 99% of the cases, people who disagree with the science of climate change are really doing so because they disagree with the solutions.
Right. Yeah.
So it's really important, I think, to recognize that climate change is a big problem and that there are solutions that actually some people might agree with who don't like, a big government role in our personal lives. So, for example, renewable energy investment has a huge impact on the local economy. It makes us more energy independent. The military is investing extremely heavily in renewable energy because they know that's the way of the future. It reduces air pollution. Anybody whose kid has asthma cares about air pollution.
Yeah.
Saving energy is just a conservative thing to do. I mean, why should we be wasteful with our energy? If we're conservative, we should conserve the energy. So I think it is important to show that there are solutions that are compatible with a whole range of values. It isn't just a, big government comes in, tells people what to do. There's a lot that we individually can support that is good for ourselves, it's good for our families, it's good for our health, and it's even good for the economy.
Yeah, and I think I've heard about this revenue neutral carbon tax. It's a pretty good way to go as well. So.
Yeah, I think I've heard of that too.
All right. So a couple more questions. Sometimes we're in these conversations with our family members at during the holiday season, and there's more than one person around, or we only have maybe 30 minutes over the dinner table or something like that. What advice would you give us, for those situations?
I always have almost a 30-second elevator speech prepared to make sure I get across the main points that I want to communicate. Now, with friends and family, there's always going to be somebody who comes in and they just want to jab you. They just want to say, hey, I heard populations of polar bears are increasing. What do you think about that?
Right.
And so it's important to think ahead. Imagine those scenarios happening. Imagine what you're going to feel in those scenarios. And mentally prepare to answer calmly instead of saying, oh, yeah, well, you're wrong. That's not going to help. So I think a lot of it is just being prepared, knowing what's going to come. If Uncle Joe always comes out with something like that, then prepare for Uncle Joe so that when he comes out with the global temperature's going down now, say, well, Uncle Joe, I can understand why you think that because you do hear a lot of it on the news, but the truth is. And what's your truth is statement? The truth is climate is changing, humans are responsible, we're already seeing the impacts today, and we care about them not because of the polar bear necessarily, but because of how that's affecting us where we live. And here's one example of why I personally care about climate change, and you might want to too.
Wow, that's perfect. I love that. All right. Everyone, we'll write that down.
All right. I want to report after Christmas.
Yeah, everyone has that Uncle Joe who wants to throw a jab. We all have that.
Yeah.
Mine's the brother Joe, but we'll go. All right. So the last question we've got for you today would be, for those of us who want to read up a little bit more about this, maybe like you said, trying to understand the shared values of different people or the psychology behind denial of climate change, or maybe just uncertainty. Are there any reference materials that you could point out to us to help us out with that sort of thing?
Absolutely. There's 2 fantastic handbooks put together by Skeptical Science on the psychology of people's attitudes and perceptions on climate change. So I highly recommend those. I recommend Skeptical Science itself for just factual information on climate change. And I also recommend the Six Americas work by the Yale Climate Program, because Six Americas really helps us understand different people's attitudes on climate change and why they feel that way. Again, people are not stupid. People have reasons for feeling the way they do, and they're good reasons. And the first step, I think, towards moving forward with any talks or conversations we have is understanding and respecting people's reasons.
Great. All right, well, that's going to wrap up our time today. Once again, if you'd like to purchase Dr. Hayhoe's book, it's titled A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. You can obviously find that on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, all those good sites. Dr. Hayhoe, thanks again for speaking with us today.
Thank you.